Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the so-called Gospel of Peter. Someone recently asked me about the Gospels that didn't make the cut to make it into the canon. And I'm sure you've heard questions like that. What about the other Gospels? And there's a tendency to think that because there are these other documents that call themselves Gospels, that then they're, somehow prima facie on a par with the canonical Gospels, and this whole idea that somehow it was a close call, to choose to put the canonical Gospels in the canon as opposed to the ones that are not designated as canonical. And there are a lot of things wrong with that claim, and I just want to focus on a portion of the so-called Gospel of Peter today. Having thrown my scare quotes in already a couple of times, I'll just content myself with calling it the Gospel of Peter as I go on, because I've made it clear that I don't think it should be spoken of as if it's, even on the face of it, appears to be really from Peter or has a claim on a par with that of the canonical Gospels. But I want to give you some reasons for that. Now, sometimes you'll hear a point which is a legitimate point. It just doesn't happen to be the point I'm making today, which is that the description of Jesus' resurrection in the Gospel of Peter is ludicrous, because the cross literally walks, it comes out from the tomb, and there's a voice that says, have you preached, I think it's, have you preached to the dead, or have you preached to the captives? And the cross says yes. And so it's a walking, talking cross, and Jesus himself is so tall that he reaches up above the heavens and so forth. And I think it's completely legitimate to point to the relatively restrained narratives surrounding the resurrection in the Gospels. And just because something is a story of a miracle, it doesn't follow that it's ridiculous or pointlessly showy or strange in the specific way that description of the resurrection is in the Gospel of Peter. But that's just not what I'm focusing on today, even though I think it's a completely fair point. I'm focusing on the narrative of Jesus' crucifixion. And I'm going to read some quotations here. I believe this is from the Raymond Brown translation of the Gospel of Peter. And there will be some asterisks in here, but I'll provide a link to the translation I'm reading so that you can see that I haven't left out something that's crucial or that would change the point that I'm making. So I'm just going to read this short excerpt. But of the Jews none washed his hands, neither Herod nor one of his judges. And since they did not desire to wash, Pilate stood up. And then Herod the king orders the Lord to be taken away, having said to them, what I ordered you to do, do. But Joseph, the friend of Pilate and of the Lord, had been standing there, and knowing they were about to crucify him, he came before Pilate and requested the body of the Lord for burial. And Pilate, having sent to Herod, requested his body. And Herod said, Brother Pilate, even if no one had requested him, we would have buried him, since indeed Sabbath is dawning, for in the law it has been written, the sun is not to set on one put to death. And he gave him over to the people before the first day of their feast of the unleavened bread. And they brought two wrongdoers and crucified the Lord in the middle of them. And having put his garments before him, they divided them up and threw as a gamble for them. And the Jews rejoiced and gave his body to Joseph that he might bury it. All right. End of quotation from the Gospel of Peter. Now, this will be a slightly expanded version of what I wrote to the person who asked me about this. Despite the fact that it's obviously heavily derivative from the canonical Gospels, the author does not know what he needs to keep from the canonical Gospels in order to make his account look historical. It's very, very important. He's obviously getting a lot of this sort of from the canonical Gospels, but then he's just sort of muddling it up. The intricate interaction of jurisdictions and powers among Pilate, the Jewish leaders, and Herod is hopelessly muddled in this Gospel, but accurately and naturally presented in the canonical Gospels. In the Gospel of Peter, it is Herod who orders the crucifixion, which is historically incorrect. That would indeed have been something for the procurator to order, Pilate being the procurator, as in the canonical Gospels. Although Antipas, Herod Antipas, which is who this is, evidently had the power to order an execution of a non-citizen, as in the case of John the Baptist, as far as I know, he did not order crucifixions, and especially wouldn't have been doing so qua a Jew or a Jewish leader. And this is important. Now, on this point, I'm willing to be corrected, but as far as I've been able to tell, I've not been able to find any instance of a member of the Herodian dynasty ordering a crucifixion. John the Baptist is beheaded. And in particular, notice in the Gospel of Peter, it refers to Herod as a Jew. Of the Jews, none washed his hands, neither Herod nor one of his judges. He was technically an Idumean. The Herodians like to sort of portray themselves as Jewish, but in fact they were not. They were not Jews. The author of the Gospel of Peter portrays Herod as just being unequivocally a Jew, the leader of the Jews, the king of the Jews, and so forth. Well, crucifixion, for sure, was not a Jewish method of execution. And that's one of the reasons why the religious leaders bring Jesus to Pilate. They want Jesus crucified. And so they know they need Roman help to bring about that particularly gruesome and shameful and public form of execution. And the gospel authors get that right, that they would have needed to get Roman help for that. But the Gospel of Peter does not get that right. Then it says, then I went on in what I wrote. Joseph of Arimathea asks Pilate for Jesus' body in the Gospel of Peter. But Pilate then has to send to Herod to get Herod's permission to tell Joseph of Arimathea that he, Joseph of Arimathea, has permission to take the body. Now, that's ridiculous. Pilate certainly would have had the jurisdiction to decide, which friend or relative or whatever to give the body to. He wouldn't have had to send to Herod and say, is it okay for me to give this body to this man? That's just wrong. In the Gospel of Peter, the Jews themselves crucified Jesus, which is entirely historically inaccurate. Bart Ehrman has tried to say that in the Gospel of John, the Jews crucified Jesus, and I hit this in one of my videos on whether the Gospels become more anti-Semitic as time goes on, as Ehrman has claimed. It's really a very poor thing that Ehrman does. He plucks this verse out of context and then ignores the fact that it talks about the soldiers crucifying Jesus, and that it's Pilate hands him over, but he's sending them with soldiers and refers to the soldiers and the centurions and so forth. But it is true to say that in the Gospel of Peter, it's the Jews personally, specifically, that crucify him. And they also divide and gamble for Jesus' clothes. And it's interesting that I talk about this in my book, Testimonies to the Truth. It's very realistic that there would have been a quaternion of Roman soldiers in charge of or carrying out Jesus' crucifixion. And it specifically says in the canonical Gospels that it was they divided, his clothes into 4 piles for the soldiers. And it's just this sort of indirect recognition of that Roman custom of a quaternion, just very artless, without, saying, hey, look, I know there was a quaternion. John's just showing that they divided it into 4, but of course that's all gone. In the Gospel of Peter, it's the Jews dividing his garments and so forth, and then it's the Jews who give his body to Joseph of Arimathea. Also, where is all of this taking place? Are Herod and Pilate together or not? It's when you read the beginning of this passage that I just read to you, like nobody's washing his hands and Pilate is standing up, and then Herod is ordering the Lord to be taken away and to be crucified. And Joseph of Arimathea is quote unquote standing there, but when Joseph of Arimathea quote comes before Pilate, well, weren't Pilate and Joseph and Herod all in the same room together, and asks for the body, then Pilate has to send to Herod to request the body. So it's just very weird and kind of jumbled as to where this is even happening. In the Gospel of Luke, when Pilate does temporarily send Jesus to Herod Antipas, it's very clear. He sends him to Herod Antipas, and then after Herod allows his men at arms to, beat Jesus and mistreat him, he sends him back to Pilate. So there's no question of who's where and whether Pilate and Herod are together and so forth. It's much clearer, much more realistic, believable, and so forth. In the canonical Gospels, the leaders pressure Pilate into ordering the crucifixion precisely because they have no jurisdiction to execute, and because crucifixion is a Roman, not a Jewish mode of execution. The fact that the Jews have no jurisdictional power to execute is confirmed by Josephus separately. Josephus gives it as the reason for the deposition by Rome of the high priest who later ordered the death, stoning, and then being bludgeoned to death of James the Just. Now, yes, in Acts, Stephen is lynched by a Jewish mob and stoned, not crucified, I would mention. And there's no indication that anybody gets in trouble for that. As in most such cases, it partly depends on how important you are. And Josephus emphasizes that James the Just was actually very popular among certain groups of the Jews, so they actually go and lodge a complaint on behalf of, the cause of James the Just, who was killed with Rome, and then, Rome takes cognizance of the fact that they exceeded their authority. So the Gospels understand this. They're very clear as to who has what jurisdiction. Herod is just sort of there in the Gospel of Peter, clearly taken to be a Jewish king of the Jews. This unclarity about who Herod Antipas is completely absent in the canonical Gospels. We find in the canonical Gospels his highly controversial marriage to Herodias, his brother's wife, which was scandalous in Jewish eyes. That's also confirmed by Josephus. The author of the Gospel of Peter doesn't appear to know, or maybe doesn't care, why Pilate brought Herod into the matter at all. But in the canonical Gospels, it's quite clear, specifically in Luke, which is the only place where it's mentioned. Pilate happens to hear in the course of talking with Jesus' accusers that Jesus is from Galilee. And it's been made clear that Antipas is the tetrarch of Galilee. Luke knows this. And so then Pilate hopes to ease the pressure on himself by getting a second opinion, as it were. He's like, oh, he's Galilean, take him to Herod. Okay, Luke 23:6, that's the reason. He happens to be in Jerusalem at the time, but he's the tetrarch ruling Galilee. This is all very realistic. This is clear. And the gospel authors know this. The author of the Gospel of Peter has no idea. And then there's the lovely and delicate reference in Luke 23:12 to the fact that from that day forward, Herod and Pilate were friends. They hadn't been friends before. This is a very believable outcome of Pilate's cynical bureaucratic recognition of Herod's authority in Galilee, because Herod was pleased to get a compliment, that it was like a compliment. Oh, I don't want to impinge upon your territorial jurisdiction. I want your opinion of this guy because he's a Galilean. And of course, in the canonical Gospels, it doesn't work to get Pilate off the hook because the leaders still want Jesus crucified. Also in the canonical Gospels, they threaten to complain to Caesar that Pilate is excusing an insurrectionist against Rome. In Luke 23:2, they lie. They say that Jesus said not to pay taxes to Caesar, which of course is the opposite. He said, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, to God the things that are God's. In John 19:12, they say, if you let him go, you're not a friend of Caesar. And so they try to frighten him that way. And that realistically brings about Pilate's capitulation. This is all lost in the Gospel of Peter, and I think it's lost on the author of the Gospel of Peter. He doesn't understand it, so he doesn't keep it. He doesn't bother with it when he's, sort of mining out certain things from the canonical Gospels. And then because he himself isn't working from original sources about the event, some kind of, independent factual source, in addition to the Gospels, the real historical relationships among these people cannot arise organically in the document as they arise organically in the canonical Gospels. So the description of how it came about that Jesus was crucified, which, notice, by the way, is not in and of itself even a miracle, is very historically grounded, very historically based in the canonical Gospels, and exactly the opposite in the so-called Gospel of Peter. I want to close by reading a quote. It's really one of my favorites. It's a little bit of a long quote, but I just love this quote, so I'm going to read it anyway. It's from an author named George Rawlinson, writing in 1860. And I just think that what I've talked about today is an especially good example of what Rawlinson is talking about. Here's Rawlinson. The political condition of Palestine at the time to which the New Testament narrative properly belongs was one curiously complicated and anomalous. It underwent frequent changes, but retained through all of them certain peculiarities, which made the position of the country unique among the dependencies of Rome. Not having been conquered in the ordinary way, but having passed under the Roman domination, with the consent and by the assistance of a large party among the inhabitants, it was allowed to maintain for a while a species of semi-independence, not unlike that of various native states in India, which are really British dependencies. A mixture, and to some extent an alternation, of Roman with native power resulted from this arrangement, and a consequent complication in the political status, which must have made it very difficult to be thoroughly understood by anyone who was not a native and a contemporary. The chief representative of the Roman power in the East, the president of Syria, the local governor, whether a Herod or a Roman procurator, and the high priest had each and all certain rights and a certain authority in the country. A double system of taxation, a double administration of justice, and even in some degree a double military command were the natural consequence, while Jewish and Roman customs, Jewish and Roman words, were simultaneously in use, and a condition of things existed full of harsh contrasts, strange mixtures, and abrupt transitions. Within the space of 50 years, Palestine was a single united kingdom under a native ruler, a set of principalities under native ethnarchs and tetrarchs, a country in part containing such principalities, in part reduced to the condition of a Roman province, a kingdom reunited once more under a native sovereign, and a country reduced wholly under Rome and governed by procurators dependent on the president of Syria, but still subject in certain respects to the Jewish monarch of a neighboring territory. These facts we know from Josephus and other writers who, though less accurate, on the whole confirm his statements. They render the civil history of Judea during the period one very difficult to master and remember. The frequent changes supervening upon the original complication are a fertile source of confusion, and seem to have bewildered even the sagacious and painstaking Tacitus. The New Testament narrative, however, falls into no error in treating of the period. It marks, incidentally, and without effort or pretension, the various changes in the civil government, the sole kingdom of Herod the Great, the partition of his dominions among his sons, the reduction of Judea to the condition of a Roman province, while Galilee Etruria, and Trachonitis continued under native princes. The restoration of the Old Kingdom of Palestine in the person of Agrippa I, and the final reduction of the whole under Roman rule and re-establishment of procurators as the civil heads, while a species of ecclesiastical superintendence, was exercised by Agrippa II. Again, the New Testament narrative exhibits in the most remarkable way the mixture in the government. The occasional power of the president of Syria is shown in Cyrenius's taxing, the ordinary division of authority between the high priest and the procurator, the existence of two separate taxations, the civil and the ecclesiastical, the census and the didrachim, of two tribunals, two modes of capital punishment, two military forces, two methods of marking time. At every turn it shows, even in such little measures as verbal expressions, the coexistence of Jewish with Roman ideas and practices in the country, a coexistence which, it must be remembered, came to an end within 40 years of our Lord's crucifixion. Thus, Rawlinson, and he is so right. So, bear this in mind as yet another thing to remember if and when you hear, but what about those other Gospels that didn't make the cut? Please click like and subscribe, and come back next time to the Lydia McGrew YouTube channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.